Hey, 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 happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to another Daily Dose. It is Friday, January 13th. I'm your host, Kaliko Castile, joined by my co-host, Precious. What up, Precious?
Hey everyone, happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Dose, episode 18 actually. So
18.
ready
Let's get
to get started.
yeah, let's get after it. So, this is actually an article we wanted to cover today, which is from Marijuana Moment a couple of weeks ago, but we haven't had a chance to chat about it yet. And it actually, I think, is we're starting to see some more conversations bubble up about it. So it's something we definitely wanted to make sure we cover. The headline is entitled "Virginia GOP Lawmaker Files Marijuana Sales Bill for 2023, Eliciting Mixed Advocacy Reactions." And that's to say the least. I'll go ahead and start by just reading the first paragraph here. This was written by Kyle Yeager, once again at marijuanamoment.net. A Republican Virginia lawmaker has filed a bill to create a regulated marijuana market in the Commonwealth, but it's drawing mixed reactions from advocates, some of whom view it as a giveaway to large multi-state operators at the expense of equity for people harmed by the war on drugs. Looks like Delegate Keith Hodges, a Republican, introduces the legislation, which would build on Virginia's current law that allows adult use cannabis possession and personal cultivation by establishing a commercial marketplace. So, just as a reminder, Virginia passed legalization a couple years ago. Yeah, I think a couple years ago now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Time goes by. A couple of years ago, they passed it, but it did not actually set up the marketplace like they're saying. So, this is a bill to actually set up the regulation to have dispensaries and retail outlets. Previously, it was just allowed to have possession and personal cultivation, but this would actually be setting up a regulatory system. But boy, this regulatory system is not currently, as written, planning to be very equitable. So let's read a little bit more of this. What this latest proposal, HB 1464, would do is amend the previously passed regulatory provisions, giving legislators an alternative model for the market. Some have defended the measure, arguing that the revised language provides a necessary and practical path forward to finally give consumers access to regulated products under a partially GOP-controlled legislature administration. Others find the changes, particularly as they concern social equity provisions, unworkable. So we're going to get into that in just a second, but I do think it is really interesting to highlight. Precious had brought this up right before we went live, but this was actually a bill that was passed and signed by a Democratic governor, but now the implementation is actually being seen by a Republican governor, right? So it is interesting to see how, when the Democrats are in control, they barely got some social equity provisions language added into the bill. Now that the Republicans are in charge, it says this bill is actually proposes to remove language that calls on regulators to develop standards on prioritizing social equity applicants. Instead, regulators would need to consider ways to prioritize any applicant who intends to operate in a historically economically disadvantaged area rather than those who are from such an area, right? So these guys are actually wanting to remove the parts of the bill that say that you need to prioritize social equity applicants. And not only that, they don't want to make it so that you qualify based on where you're from, that being from a disadvantaged population, but actually just that you'd be willing to do business there, right? So it doesn't matter that you're from there or not, just as you're doing business in an economically disadvantaged area. So super interesting that this is like so blatant that we're going to actually just remove the very few pieces that we had in here to make sure that we could try to repair the damage done by prohibition. And you got to think, like, Virginia is one of the original slave states, right? It's like this goes back to the old South in Virginia. Like, this is very much like, if there's any place where social equity provisions need to be in the bill, need to be at the center of the conversation, Virginia is the place, right? So here you are having one of the delegates from the Republican-controlled legislature trying to actually remove those provisions. What are your thoughts, Precious? I can imagine what they are, but what are your thoughts?
Virginia. I remember even back in 21 as we were, watching, and shout out to the folks who are hands down boots on the ground in Virginia, especially marijuana justice and all the advocates there. It was a fight to even get that part of the legislation passed that would set up a market by 2024 and launch sales by then. And you had the Cannabis Investment Fund. Again, you had the certain social equity provisions to prioritize people of color. And that was even highly debated and went through a lot just to see through. And again, like we mentioned, under a Democratic governor. And this is just a perfect example of how cannabis is essentially politics at the same time. If you take this micro kind of situation that's happening in Virginia and just look at it in a macro way and like across like a federal level, even going back to safe banking and how it came back to the balance between Democrats and Republicans and who has this many votes or not, that's very important. So when we're doing get out the vote drives and things of that nature and doing election times, it's because of these very reasons. So, now you have a Republican House in Virginia and a Republican governor who are essentially walking back the hours and hours of hard work by advocates to implement some of these items. I mean, one of the most jarring ones for me was originally sales taxes of up to 10% would have went to the Cannabis Equity Reinvestment Fund. Actually, 30% of tax revenue would go to the Cannabis Equity Reinvestment Fund and 10% as an excise tax. And that now is looking to be redacted in this new amendment that's being proposed. So it just leads me to ask, well, what are you going to do with the tax revenue then? How are you going to start to really, repair those harms? Because that'll be the language being used. And, I think a lot of just regulators or some of our elected officials like to use, we want to get the market up and going, and that regulated market will then start to stop the excessiveness of the legacy market, which is essentially true, and we've seen in other states, but that's just not it. That's not the only reason to legalize. So I just think everyone has to really roll up their sleeves and advocates, even if you're not in Virginia, you just really have to kind of tune in, because this can Virginia can just turn into its own oligopoly of just centralized large companies who will have essentially no restrictions on how they're able to operate there with I wouldn't say any or little to no, with no social equity measures. So,
I mean, they're like you're saying, they're totally gutting the social equity measures completely, right? Like I was just reading another paragraph here that I'll read for folks listening in. It would also delete language that calls for a cannabis business and equity task force to develop requirements for prospective multi-license holders to submit diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, for example. And it would also delete an entire section that lays out social equity license applicant criteria, such as ownership by people with prior cannabis convictions, right? So it's like, it's so crazy that in just a week after New York just opened up, right, which is going to the extreme of making sure that social equity applicants have a seat at the table, are going first, even if that means only opening one store on day one, right? Like here in Virginia, they're literally going to gut any ability to have social equity provisions or even like application requirements for people, right? Like they're just basically getting rid of it. So it's interesting to see in 1 week's time. Well, this obviously happened a couple of weeks ago, so still would have been 1 week on the other side. Just so interesting to see the completely two different worlds there.
Yeah, it really is. And again, the cover for that would be that, we're trying to not make it such a complicated bill so that it's easier for folks to get in, apply, and stand up the regulated market. That line is not flying with people anymore. You can't just want to walk back social equity in order to push a market opening quicker, as that new version will then support Black and brown people who are supposed to be applying and trying to find resources to help them apply, which is essentially what social equity policies will do. And Virginia is the South, like you mentioned, one of the original slave states. So it's not even necessarily surprising. It's especially disappointing. And even moving forward, there's another article that recently came out. Governor Youngkin, he is essentially really ramping up enforcement around cannabis businesses that are already operating there medically. And again, we talk about Delta. We haven't talked about Delta 8 and Delta 10 and, just basically breaking down the plants. Maybe that'll be another episode where we get into all of that and the lack of regulation around Delta 8 and some of the regulations that are now happening. But I just feel like Virginia uses some of these items to aggressively obstruct what the cannabis industry is trying to do and what business owners are trying to do. There's a businesswoman out in Virginia who was quoted in a recent article who mentioned that she's looking at layoffs or potentially shutting down her medical dispensary because primary of their sales to date were Delta 8. And there weren't, really hard enforcements. There were workarounds. There were, starting to learn about the product and the safety of it. And I still do believe that there needs to be regulations around it. But it's also the manner in which Virginia just goes about stuff. It just makes it very hard to think that there is a, there is a point to support Black and brown people there. Like there is a absolute, by all means necessary. And frankly, it's not. And again, I think this just speaks to the larger political conversation that happens when cannabis and politics get entwined. And the people who are most affected when that play happens are minority communities. So
that's great. It's a great point. And one of the things I wanted to highlight too is because especially as it related to the safe banking conversation over the last couple of months. So a lot of people talk about how like there's no difference between the two parties on where they stand on it, right? And that may be the case if you're comparing two individual members of either party, right? But I do think it's really, really important for folks to do their research and to figure out where people stand on these issues, right? Because I think Virginia is a clear case of how two parties treated something differently, right? And so I think it's really important that people do their research, find out, where do your people stand? Because it's not always the same too. You have people at the local level who will feel differently than national representatives of that same party, right? So don't just automatically assume because you've heard one thing from one person, it bleeds over to the other. Like you should be doing your research, reaching out and actually making sure what they stand on. And now that, these Republicans are showing you where they stand and that they're pushing these bills, like we have to now organize to try to kill them and try to make sure that this is not what ends up passing. And so I think that's why it's super important for people to be involved. I know you kind of mentioned it earlier, but this is inherently a political industry. So if you're in this industry, you've got to be ready to politically organize and make sure that you're getting involved. Obviously here at MCBA, we are a trade association. We deal with federal and state and local lobbying. If you're in Virginia and this is something that you're trying to fight, I know there are local organizations there. We're also trying to start pulling together our grassroots committee right now. So we actually have signups for our committees that we can drop in the chat. But I do want to make sure that people are signing up to join the grassroots committee because this is going to be our effort to really start to regionally organize and make sure that we can respond to some of these blowbacks that are happening in some of these states, because it's not all sunshines and rainbows. Like there's a lot of times where things are really, really hard and you really have to do the work of educating folks. And so we want to make sure that as we are putting out resources that we're able to disseminate through this grassroots committee. So if you're in Virginia and you want to join MCBA, we'd love to have you. Go to minoritycannabis.org, sign up as a member today, and then let's get to it and make sure that we can keep the fight up in places like Virginia and many other states in the South that are going to start to come online in the years to come, because it's going to take a lot of work and it's not a for sure thing. And I think it's evidenced by what we're covering today. So I appreciate everybody joining us for another episode of the Daily Dose. Precious, are there any any announcements or anything that we want to cover before we go today?
Yeah, no, we have been pushing our small business education series, which will be taking place next on Wednesday, January 25th. Again, if you're a new cannabis entrepreneur, even if you've been in the game for a while, we're going back to the basics and talking about business plans and business development. So you don't want to miss that. Definitely want to register for it. And again, if you're a member, we have our member meeting coming up, our first one of the year. We're excited to talk about all the things we have in store. And of course, we have our New Year same vision donation drive going on. So we're asking all of you guys that support MCBA and see the work that we're doing to continue to support us and to donate to our mission. I'll drop the donation link down here in the chat. And again, it's really just to help us revamp our national social equity report. It's to us to continue to put on programming, continue to put on events, continue to lobby, continue to attack some of these policies we're seeing that are redundant, essentially what we discussed now in Virginia. So again, any contribution is greatly appreciated, and you can continue to follow us for more information on all of these upcoming events and programs.
Yeah, great call. Please do donate and become a member, right? Like we are only able to do the work we do by having members and by having people donate their money. We're an all volunteer board. And actually, we just elected 6 new board members that we're going to announce next week. So really look forward to talking about that. We'll probably cover it on the Daily Dose on one of our episodes next week. But please make sure you do donate or become a member. We're happy to have conversations with you if you want to learn more about membership, if you want to know how would this benefit my business, how can I actually make this worth the dollars, Precious and I are happy to have a conversation. So please make sure you're reaching out. And we really appreciate you guys tuning in. And one more plug. This is now a podcast. It started as just a live stream we were doing on LinkedIn regularly, but it is now uploaded to all of the major podcasting platforms, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So please make sure wherever you subscribe, go look up The Daily Dose. Might be worth typing in The Daily Dose MCBA. We'll also put some links directly in the comments and in the descriptions of the video as well. We're also on YouTube. Subscribe there. We're going to be doing a lot of content in 2023. Precious is doing a really great job of helping us lay all this stuff out. So we're really excited to keep bringing it all to you. We hope you guys will continue to follow along, and we hope that you guys will become a member. So thank you so much for joining us for another episode of The Daily Dose. Until next week on Monday, aloha.